No one at Lawson Enterprises ever imagined that the man sitting behind the glass-walled corner office, one of the richest, most respected CEOs in the city, was living with a secret that could destroy everything he had built. Richard Lawson was the kind of man people whispered about in awe. He had power, influence, and a reputation for turning failing companies into gold mines. Every magazine called him the miracle businessman. His suits were always tailored, his smile always charming, and his words smooth as silk. But behind that perfect image was a loneliness that even his billions couldn't hide. Every morning, he walked through the grand marble lobby of Lawson Enterprises, and employees straightened their backs as he passed. He'd nod politely, but his eyes rarely met anyone's for more than a second. He was a man used to being admired, not known. And then came Angela Carter. Angela was different from anyone Richard had ever met. She wasn't impressed by titles or fancy cars. She was a quiet, hard-working woman who treated everyone with respect, from the janitor to the executives. Her warm smile and calm nature had a way of softening the room, even when tension filled the air. Richard noticed her one late evening after everyone else had left. Angela was still at her desk, her lamp casting a warm glow over piles of reports. He stopped and asked, "Still working?" She looked up, a bit startled, and smiled. "Just trying to get this presentation perfect before tomorrow." Something about her sincerity disarmed him. She wasn't nervous talking to him like everyone else. She didn't flatter him or rush to impress. She just talked. And that, to a man like Richard, felt strangely rare. Days turned into weeks, and their professional exchanges became longer, warmer. Richard found excuses to visit her department, sometimes to check on progress, sometimes just to ask how her day was. Angela always greeted him with that same kindness, never suspecting that she had already captured his attention. Then came the night that changed everything. The office was nearly empty after a major project deadline. Angela was there again, going over final figures. Richard, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, poured himself a drink in his office and decided to thank her personally for her dedication. He walked over, loosened his tie, and leaned against her desk. "You've done more for this company than most people twice your position. I hope you know that," Angela smiled softly. "Thank you, sir. I just try to do my best." "Call me Richard," he said with a half-smile. There was silence for a moment, just the hum of the city below, and the sound of rain tapping the windows. One look, one heartbeat, and a line that should never have been crossed was crossed. That night turned into many more stolen nights. Secret meetings, late dinners, the kind of dangerous closeness that can only exist when both hearts know it's wrong, but can't stop. For Angela, it wasn't about money or power. She saw a broken man beneath the wealth, someone who wanted to be loved not for his success, but for who he truly was. And Richard found peace in her presence. For the first time in years, he laughed freely, he listened, he cared. But as their hidden relationship grew, so did the risk. Richard's assistant started noticing his late-night absences. Board members whispered about a mystery woman. He knew what would happen if anyone found out. Scandal, headlines, investors pulling out. Everything he had worked for could vanish, yet in Angela's eyes he felt human again. One evening, as they sat in his office watching the rain, Angela turned to him and asked softly, "Do you ever wish you could just leave all of this behind? The money, the pressure, all of it?" He smiled faintly. "Every single day. But people like me don't get to walk away. We just keep pretending." She reached for his hand and he didn't pull away. That simple touch said more than words ever could. But the illusion couldn't last forever. A few weeks later, Angela missed work for the first time in months. When she finally returned, her face looked pale, her hands trembling as she walked into his office. "Richard," she began, voice quivering, I need to tell you something." He looked up from his desk, half distracted. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like thunder. Richard froze. His world, the perfect image, the spotless reputation, started to shake. Angela waited for him to say something, anything. But his silence told her everything she feared. He stood up slowly, pacing behind his desk, mind racing. "This can't happen, not now, not to me." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "I thought you'd want to know. I thought you cared." He turned to her, guilt and fear battling behind his eyes. Angela, this can't get out. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand perfectly, she said quietly. You care more about your image than the life we created. She walked out before he could say another word, leaving him standing there surrounded by everything he thought mattered. His empire, his power, and yet feeling completely empty. That was the day Richard Lawson's greatest secret began. A secret that would stay buried for 24 long years. Until the day it finally came back to his office, knocking on his door in the form of a man he'd never met, but could never forget. The morning after Angela told Richard the truth, the walls of Lawson Enterprises felt colder than ever. He avoided her eyes, avoided her department, and threw himself into meetings and contracts pretending nothing had changed. But deep down, every tick of the clock reminded him of what he'd done. Angela waited for days, hoping he'd come to her, hoping he'd at least ask how she was feeling. But Richard stayed silent. The same man who had once held her hand under city lights now couldn't even look at her in the hallway. She began to realize the truth. He wasn't just scared. He was ashamed. Then one Monday morning, she received an unexpected email from HR. Please report to Mr. Lawson's office at 10 a.m. Her heart sank. She already knew what was coming. When she entered his office, Richard didn't greet her with warmth. His tone was formal, his eyes cold. He gestured toward the chair. Please sit. Angela sat down slowly, clutching the strap of her purse. Richard, please don't do this. We can find a way to... He cut her off. Angela, I've been reviewing staffing adjustments. Unfortunately, your position has been restructured. I'm afraid we'll have to let you go. She stared at him in disbelief. Restructured? After everything I've done for this company? After everything we've been through? Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. This isn't personal. You'll receive a generous severance package and a letter of recommendation. Her voice broke. A letter of recommendation won't raise a child, Meryl. Only the sound of the city traffic humming outside his window. He finally stood up and placed a check on the desk. Take this. It's enough to help you start over. Find a better place. You deserve that much. Angela looked at the check like it was poison. You think money can fix this? That this child is just a mistake you can pay to forget? Richard's jaw tightened. You don't understand what's at stake, Angela. My family name, my reputation, everything I've built. If this gets out, it will ruin me. She rose from her seat, trembling with anger and heartbreak. And what about me, Richard? What about us? You used me, and now you're throwing me away like I'm just another liability. Her tears began to fall, but she refused to let him see her break. You once told me I made you feel human again. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe you never wanted to be human. You just wanted control. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she whispered, Don't worry, Richard. You'll never have to see me again. But one day you'll see him, and you'll know what you lost. Then she was gone. For days after, the office buzzed with quiet rumors. Some said Angela had quit, others said she'd been transferred. Richard made sure no one knew the truth. He signed her termination papers, buried her personnel file, and moved on like nothing had happened. But every time he passed the desk where she used to sit, his chest tightened. Angela's world, however, fell apart. Without a job, pregnant, and alone, she struggled to find work. Some companies turned her away when they learned she was expecting. She took temporary jobs, cleaning offices, doing late shifts at diners, anything to make ends meet. The nights were the hardest. She'd sit by the window of her tiny apartment, hands resting on her growing belly, whispering, Don't worry, baby. Mommy's going to make sure you have a good life. There were times she wanted to reach out to Richard, to beg him to be there, but her pride wouldn't allow it. She wouldn't let her child grow up seeing his mother begging a man who didn't have the courage to love her. Months later, she gave birth to a baby boy, Marcus. The moment she held him in her arms, everything changed. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and tears streamed down her face. He had Richard's eyes, but her heart. Angela promised herself that day that Marcus would never feel unwanted. She would give him every ounce of love she had. She would be both mother and father, no matter how hard it got. The first few years were brutal. Bills piled up. Some nights they had to choose between rent and groceries. But Angela never complained. She sang to her baby, read him stories, and told him he could be anything he wanted to be. And she kept her promise. She never spoke badly of his father. She only told him, "Your dad was a powerful man, but he was afraid of his own heart." Meanwhile, miles away, Richard tried to bury the guilt that haunted him. He threw himself deeper into work, expanding his empire, collecting awards, and smiling for cameras. People saw a successful man at the peak of his power. But at night, when he poured himself a drink and sat alone in his mansion, he sometimes saw her face. He'd close his eyes and he'd hear her last words echo in his mind. "One day you'll see him, and you'll know what you lost." He didn't know when or how, but those words would come true. Because the past has a way of finding its way back, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The years rolled by like the slow turning of a heavy clock, and through every passing season, Angela and Marcus built a life out of almost nothing. Marcus grew up in a small apartment with peeling walls, but to him, it was home. It smelled of his mother's cooking and love. She would come home late, exhausted from her double shifts, but she always brought him something: a warm hug, a bedtime story, or a few kind words that kept his little world bright. He learned early that his mother was his hero. While other kids talked about their fathers, Marcus noticed his mother's eyes grow distant at the mention. Once when he was 8, he finally asked, "Mom, where's my dad?" Angela froze for a moment, her hand trembling slightly as she folded the laundry. Then she smiled softly and said, "Your father was a man who made mistakes, but you don't need him to be great. You've got me and I've got you." Marcus didn't ask again. From that day on, he made a promise to himself. If his father had chosen not to be in his life, then Marcus would become the kind of man any father should have been proud of. At school, he was sharp and determined. Teachers noticed his curiosity and drive. He loved numbers, business ideas, and the thought of building something that could change lives. He didn't know it yet, but in some strange twist of fate, he had inherited more than just his father's eyes. He had inherited his ambition, too. Angela watched him grow into a young man with pride swelling in her chest. Every certificate, every report card, every late-night study session reminded her that all the pain had been worth it. Still, when she looked at him sometimes, she couldn't help but see glimpses of the man who once broke her heart. The same sharp jawline, the same way of thinking before speaking. But Marcus wasn't Richard. He had something his father had lost long ago: a conscience. By the time he turned 18, Marcus had earned a full scholarship to a top university. Angela cried when the acceptance letter arrived. "You did it, baby. You really did it." At university, Marcus thrived. He majored in business and finance, the very world that had once destroyed his mother's peace. But to him, it wasn't about greed or power. It was about redemption. He wanted to understand the system that had cast them aside and find a way to rise within it. On his own terms, he spent his summers working internships, saving money, and sending some back home to help Angela with bills. They spoke every night no matter how busy he got. "Mom," he'd say with a grin over the phone, "one day I'll buy you a house, a real one. With a big garden and no leaky pipes," Angela laughed. "You don't have to buy me anything, Marcus. You already gave me everything I ever wanted," but he meant it. Deep down, Marcus had a fire that couldn't be put out. He wanted to build something bigger than himself. He wanted to make his mother proud, and to make whoever his father was regret walking away. After graduation, Marcus's professors recommended him to several companies. He went to interviews confident but humble. Then one day an email caught his eye. Lawson Real Estate Holdings, junior executive position. The name stirred something strange in him. It felt familiar, though he couldn't say why. He had seen it before, on old news articles, business journals, and television. Lawson Real Estate was one of the most successful corporations in the country. When he told Angela about the offer, her face turned pale. She gripped the edge of the table. "Lawson?" She repeated softly, her voice almost trembling. "Yeah," Marcus said with excitement. "You've heard of it, right? It's one of the top firms in the city. They're offering me a chance to prove myself." Angela forced a smile. That's wonderful, Marcus." He noticed something in her tone, something off, but she didn't say more. Later that night, she sat by her window in silence, staring at the city lights. Her past was catching up and she knew it. But she couldn't stop her son from walking into his destiny. When Marcus showed up for his first day at Lawson Real Estate, he felt like he was walking into a dream. The towering glass building shimmered in the sunlight, the same place where, years ago, his mother's life had fallen apart. But he didn't know that. He only knew he was stepping into his future. He impressed everyone from the start. Sharp mind, polite manner, confident presence. Even the older executives admired him. He was respectful but not afraid to speak his mind. There was something magnetic about him, something that made people listen when he talked. And soon, his work began to catch the attention of the man at the very top, Richard Lawson himself. One day, as Richard reviewed the profiles of promising new hires, a familiar name caught his attention, Marcus Carter. The name stirred something in his memory, though he couldn't place it. When Marcus walked into his office for the first time, Richard extended his hand and said, "Welcome aboard, son. See what you got." Neither of them knew that moment was fate finally turning full circle. Angela, sitting alone at home, prayed quietly that night. She whispered, "Lord, please watch over him. Don't let him carry the pain I once did." But fate had already set things in motion. The son of the man who betrayed her had unknowingly returned to the same building, to the same man who had once destroyed their lives. And soon, truth would come knocking. The first time Richard Lawson laid eyes on Marcus Carter, he felt something strange stir inside him. The young man stood tall, confident but humble, dressed neatly in a crisp white shirt. There was something familiar in his eyes, something that tugged at a corner of Richard's memory. He couldn't quite explain it, but for the first time in years he felt a sense of curiosity he hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. "Welcome to Lawson Real Estate Holdings," Richard said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it firmly, smiling politely. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be here. I've admired your work for years," Richard chuckled lightly. "Well, let's hope I don't disappoint you." The meeting was brief, but the impression it left was deep. Over the next few weeks, Marcus quickly became one of the most talked-about employees in the company. His intelligence, his drive, and the way he carried himself, it all reminded Richard of his younger self. He saw in Marcus the kind of passion and integrity that had once defined him before greed and fear had consumed his heart. Marcus worked hard, staying late, often reviewing reports long after others had gone home. Richard noticed it and began mentoring him personally, inviting him into high-level meetings, introducing him to clients, and even sharing business strategies that most executives could only dream of hearing. The more they worked together, the closer they became. To Richard, Marcus felt like the son he never had. To Marcus, Richard became the father figure he had always wished for. There were times when Marcus would visit Richard's office just to talk. They'd discuss business, life, and ambition. Richard found himself opening up in ways that surprised even him. "You remind me of someone," he told Marcus one evening as the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers. "Someone I once knew. A long time ago," Marcus smiled. "Must have been someone important." Richard looked away, his voice soft. "She was. More than I ever realized." Marcus didn't think much of it, but the words lingered with him. There was something about the sadness in Richard's tone, something that hinted at a past filled with regret. One day while working late, Marcus accidentally left a folder on Richard's desk, a personal folder containing photos and old documents. Inside was a picture of him as a child, sitting in his mother's lap, both smiling at the camera. Richard didn't mean to pry, but when he glanced at the photo, his heart stopped. The woman in the picture was unmistakable. Angela, her face, older now but still just as he remembered, stared back at him. He froze, gripping the photo as if it might disappear. His breathing grew shallow. Memories flooded in, her laughter, her tears, the night she told him she was pregnant, the day he fired her, the look on her face as she walked out of his life forever. And now here was her son, grown, educated, brilliant, working in his company, standing before him every day without knowing the truth. Richard sat back in his chair, the weight of 2 decades crashing down on him. His hands trembled as he whispered to himself, "It can't be. It can't be her son." But deep inside he knew it was. The next morning, Richard called Marcus into his office. His tone was different, shaky, uncertain. "Marcus, where did you get this photo?" he asked, sliding the picture across the desk. Marcus looked confused at first, then smiled proudly. "That's my mom, Angela Carter." The air in the room changed instantly. Richard's throat went dry. He could barely speak. "Angela Carter?" he repeated softly. "Yes, sir. She's my mother. She raised me on her own. She's the reason I'm here today. Everything I've achieved, it's because of her." Richard felt a chill run through his body. His vision blurred for a moment as guilt, shame, and disbelief mixed together in a storm of emotion. "Marcus," he began, his voice cracking. "How old are you?" 24, Marcus replied. That number hit Richard like a hammer. 24 years. The same number of years since Angela walked out of his office, pregnant, crying, heartbroken. Marcus noticed the color drain from his face. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard took a deep breath, gripping the edge of his desk. I think you should sit down." Marcus frowned, confused but concerned. "Is something wrong?" Richard looked at him for a long time. It was as if he was staring at a mirror into the past, at the boy he had abandoned without ever knowing. His voice broke as he whispered, "Marcus." "I think I'm your father." The room went silent. The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, heavier, filling the air like thunder. Marcus blinked, frozen. "What did you just say?" Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother, Angela. She worked here years ago. He swallowed hard, unable to finish. "I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. And I've lived with them every day since." Marcus pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. His heart pounded in his chest. "You're telling me you're the man who left my mother? The one who fired her and made her raise me alone?" Richard stood too, his voice trembling. "Marcus, please, I didn't know." "Didn't know?" Marcus shouted, anger and disbelief flooding his voice. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You ruined her life. You left her to struggle while you built your empire on lies." Richard took a step forward, tears streaming down his face. "I was scared, Marcus. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting everything I'd built, but I lost the only thing that mattered." Marcus turned away, fists clenched, his jaw tight. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with the ghost of his mother's pain. "You had 24 years, Marcus said quietly. 24 years to make it right. And now you want forgiveness?" Richard's voice broke. "No, son. I don't expect forgiveness. But I'm begging for a chance, to make things right before it's too late." Marcus looked back at him, his expression torn between fury and sorrow. "Then prove it," he said. "Not to me, to her." And with that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Richard standing alone, shaking, with tears falling onto the photograph that had brought his past crashing into his present. He knew what he had to do. It was time to face the woman he had betrayed, the woman he had never stopped loving. That night, Richard Lawson couldn't sleep. His mind was a battlefield of memories and regret. He sat in the dark corner of his study, the glow from the city lights barely reaching his face. The photograph of Angela and baby Marcus lay on his desk, creased and worn from how many times he'd held it. He whispered into the empty room, "What have I done?" For 24 years he had lived like a king, surrounded by wealth, power, and everything most people dream of. But in all that success there was one thing he could never buy: peace. The image of Angela walking out of his office all those years ago had never truly left him. It haunted him in quiet moments, in the pauses between meetings, in the silence of his mansion. Now fate had forced him to face it. Her son, their son, had walked into his life, carrying not just her eyes but her strength, her integrity, and her pain. Richard knew what he had to do. The next morning, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in decades. He wasn't even sure if it would still work. His hand trembled as he waited for the line to ring. Then a gentle voice answered, "Hello?" It was her. Older, softer, but still unmistakably her. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Angela," he whispered. There was silence on the other end. Then in a cautious tone, she said, "Richard, is that really you?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I need to see you, please. It's about Marcus." Her voice tensed. "What about my son?" "Please, Angela," he pleaded. "Just give me one chance to talk to you, face to face." After a long pause, she finally said, "Fine, you know where I live." That evening, Richard found himself driving down a neighborhood he hadn't been to in years. The streets were narrow, the houses modest, It was nothing like the gated mansions he was used to, but there was something humbling about it, something that reminded him what real life looked like. When he reached her home, he sat in the car for a moment, staring at the small front porch light flickering against the night sky. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was terrified, not of being rejected, but of finally confronting the version of himself he had run from all his life. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Angela opened it slowly. Time had touched her, but her eyes were still the same, strong, calm, and full of quiet fire. For a few seconds, neither of them said a word. The years between them hung heavy in the air. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "You look older." Richard gave a faint, sad smile. "So do you." He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the small but cozy home. Family photos lined the walls, pictures of Marcus at different ages. His graduation photo caught Richard's attention. He looked so proud, standing next to his mother. Richard swallowed hard. "You did a good job with him." Angela folded her arms. "I didn't have a choice." He nodded, shame washing over him. "I know, I should have been there. I should have protected you both. Instead, I ran away." She said nothing, just looked at him, waiting for whatever excuse might come next. But this time, there was no excuse. Only truth. "I lived my whole life pretending that I'd made the right decision," he said. "I told myself it was necessary to protect my name, my company, my reputation. But none of it mattered. Not a single bit. Because every night I remembered your face, the way you looked at me when I told you to leave. I've built towers, Angela, but every one of them was built on guilt." Her expression softened, but her voice was still guarded. "And now you want forgiveness?" He shook his head. "No, I don't deserve forgiveness. I just want a chance to tell you that I'm sorry for everything. For hurting you, for leaving you alone, for missing 24 years of my son's life." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "Marcus told me what happened," she said quietly. "He came home angry and broken. You should have seen his face, Richard. It was like he'd lost something he didn't even know he had." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I can't change the past, but I want to be there for him now, if he'll let me." Angela studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "You're not the man I remember. You look tired, humbled. Maybe that's what time does. It breaks us until we see what really matters." Just then, the front door opened. Marcus walked in, stopping cold when he saw Richard standing there. His eyes widened, anger and confusion flashing across his face. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked sharply. "I came to apologize," Richard said softly. "Not as a CEO, not as a man of wealth, just as a father who failed." Marcus clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He looked at his mother, who gave a small nod as if to say, "Hear him out." Richard continued, voice trembling. "You don't owe me anything, but I need you to know, if I could trade every dollar, every success I've ever had just to be there for your first steps, your first words, your graduations, I would. I can't get those years back, but I can try to be part of your future, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. Then he took a slow breath and said, "You hurt her. You hurt both of us. But if you're really here to make things right, then start by being honest. Be the man she thought you were. Be the man I never had." Richard nodded, tears falling freely. "I will, I promise." Angela placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Maybe this is the beginning of something new," she said softly. For the first time in years, Richard felt something he hadn't known since losing Angela. Peace. It wasn't the end of the story. It was a new chapter. He looked at them both, the woman he betrayed and the son he lost, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a second chance." And as the night settled around them, 3 broken hearts began to heal, bound not by the past, but by forgiveness, love, and the courage to start again.